No theme song today. That's too girly. No, we're gonna do all manly today because we're talking about Slam Bradley. Let's jump into it. Last time we talked about my favorite Detective Comics feature, Spy, but not everyone shared my opinion of Spy, and that included the editors of National Comics who considered it a minor feature and gave it a minor page count. But there was another idea that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster had for Detective Comics that the editors loved, and it became the second feature along with Claws of the Red Dragon that I talked about two times ago, to reach a then unprecedented 13 pages, and that is Slam Bradley. Now, the first Slam Bradley story is very racist, and we will have to spend a good amount of time on this debut story, but Slam doesn't always fight ugly stereotypes of Chinese people, or celestials as they're called on this page. That's an ethnic slur you don't hear every day. In fact, it hasn't been popular since the 19th century when China was still known as the Celestial Empire, and that tells us a lot about how out of touch Siegel and Schuster were with contemporary Chinese culture, as the artwork clearly shows. Well, in this panel, we get our first description of Slam Bradley, ace freelance sleuth, which I guess is a fancier way of saying private detective, fighter, and adventurer, blah, blah, blah. Although outnumbered, Slam is having a swell time. So we know Slam loves violence. He's manly. Bam, bam. Now, there's something else about this page that might have escaped you because it's so commonplace in comic books today, but this is the first splash page in comic book history. A splash page, of course, is when you want to open your story with a bang, so you go full page on one very big dramatic moment. Eventually, it will become standard practice to include splash pages inside a story for similar dramatic moments. Sometimes the opening splash page will not actually be part of the story at all, but representative of the contents of that story, like a second cover image. But that is not the case here, as the first panel on page 2 picks up right where the splash page leaves off. In literature, the concept of starting a story during the action, after what would normally be the start of the story with no exposition, is known by the Latin phrase in medias res, and that was very normal for early comic books, of course, which usually started reprinting comic strips in the middle of their continuity, but much less common in original comic book material, but is going to be a standard feature here in these early Slam Bradley stories. We're right in the middle of a fight scene as well, and that is something new. This is an elevation of physical conflict, and this is going to become a crucial difference between comic books, which can stretch out physical conflict over a much larger territory of panels, than comic strips, which have traditionally had to resolve conflicts very swiftly for economy of space. Now, the story quickly introduces a cast of characters: Sergeant Kelly and Captain Frawley of the local police department, more on where that is later, who you might assume would become major players in the story. And then dismissively, this guy, Shorty Moran, a would-be detective who idolizes Slam, bam, bam, and took a mail-order course in scientific crime detection so he can help Slam on his cases. Now, where have we seen a hero dismissing a would-be sidekick before?
I can fly. Can you fly?
Fly home, buddy. I work alone.
Oui, et ta tenue est complètement ridicule!
Just give me one chance.
But instead of shooing Shorty out of the story, Slam hands his mission over to Shorty, thinking that prize show guard dog guarding is beneath him. Things escalate quickly, though, when the department store heiress who had tried to hire Slam is kidnapped instead of the dog, and hijinks ensue. Now, if this combination of hard fighting adventure and midget short comic relief sidekicks looks familiar, it might be because you've seen my episode 42, where I talked about Wash Tubbs and Captain Easy. This is not the first Captain Easy clone in comic books. That was Rocky Baird, and I talked about him way back in episode 27, but this is the first Wash Tubbs clone and the first successful Captain Easy clone. Easy was never adverse to violence, but didn't relish it in the way that Slam, you're going to get tired of me doing that, does. Oh, great. I left my vacuum cleaner in that last shot. Well, too bad. I like that shot. We're keeping it and we're going to move forward. So where'd I leave off? Enjoy my vacuum cleaner. Slam vacuum cleaner. It might look like the art was rushed in places, perhaps because Schuster struggled to meet the deadline in such a long story. And there are panels like this one where the colorist had to finish putting Slam's ripped shirt on him, but that's usually not the case. Shorty is intentionally drawn this way. Like Wash Tubbs, he's meant to look like a refugee from a cartoony comic strip living in a more realistic adventure strip, though this rationale is strictly meta and not literally supported in the story. If you're thinking that Slam Bradley looks like Bart Regan, who looked like Sandy Keene, who looked like Steve Carson, who looked like Dr. Occult, who looks like Superman, yes, Schuster did not have a large variety of faces that he drew for characters, and for both men and women, he had one idealized face that he used for his leads. Likewise, Rita Carlisle looks like Sally Norris, who looks like Lois Lane, but that was a stylistic choice. We know he could draw different faces when he wanted to, and both Shorty and Captain Frawley, and later Rita's chauffeur, look like no one we've seen before in his comics. Yes, the dog, who is supposed to be a poodle, looks nothing like a poodle, but if you read along with me through these early comic books, you're going to see a lot of animals not look right. There was, of course, no online image searching, and many worked on too tight a schedule to visit the local library for reference material. Many of the good artists would build large files of their own reference material, often clipped from newspapers and magazines, but these were also very poor artists in many cases, like Joe Shuster was, who could not build those collections quickly. It also looks like Slam Bradley is either prematurely white-haired or someone forgot to color his hair, but also bear in mind that conventions of art are still in flux this early in the industry, and I think that black hair is being portrayed with white highlights here deliberately so that you can see the texture of his hair. Now, why is this important when context alone would tell you that something solid black on top of his head is likely to be hair? Well, so there's this thing where 90% of the people in the industry at this time are Jewish, but their audience are not primarily Jewish, they're Gentile. And we want to make it clear, perhaps to our audience, that the heroes that they're reading about are not Jewish, but in fact Gentile with long, wavy hair instead of the curly look of Jewish hair. Just a theory. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole story with you. This is the most easily obtained Slam Bradley story there is, since most have never been reprinted, so I'll let you find out how Rita gets rescued. Despite the obvious racism, the Hideout Slam Explorer seems imaginatively designed and well drawn by Schuster, and the story is complete in this issue. Though every other Siegel Shuster feature up to this point at least started with a serialized, larger story, they do not do so this time, either by editorial fiat or perhaps Siegel just thought that 13 pages was plenty long enough for a complete long story. The second issue starts again with an innovative splash page in medias res, with Slam about to end a long slug fight, bam bam, with an equally tough steelworker named Pete Graves. We're not told how the fight started, we're told no one cares. These two are going at it like gladiators of old for sheer love of battle. They're so manly. Now, this isn't really why gladiators fought in olden times, but this is how two bookish nerds imagine manliness is like. Gray's name is foreshadowing, because later Slam is wanted for questioning when Pete is found murdered. At police headquarters, Slam even gets mad and physically assaults Pete's lawyer in front of the police chief and gets away with it. But just as you're thinking, maybe Slam is a loose cannon enough to kill someone, he gets this wild hunch that the lawyer he assaulted is up to no good and sends Shorty to follow him. When Slam gets home, a woman in his apartment shoots at him, and this trick of having an action cross two panels, Schuster may have got this idea from reading Leo O'Melia's Barry O'Neill strip, where we've talked about that before. This is left as a cliffhanger as we switch back to Shorty, who is discovered in the trunk of the lawyer's car after overhearing him talk to his henchmen about how Pete's murder was all part of an anti-union plot. And this is interesting because comic books have not always been pro-union. We've talked before about how Chesler Studio Comics repeatedly mocked unions. When Shorty resists their interrogation, the lawyer's goon resorts to torture with a heat lamp, but Shorty remarkably outsmarts the goon, turns the table on him, and leaves the goon tied up with the heat lamp pointed at his butt. Bam, bam. It's okay. Our manliness can handle comedy. Back to Slam, Bam Bam. The woman who shot at him was Pete's sister, Betty. Since she missed, because she's a girl, Slam disarms her and hangs her by a clothes hook in the closet. Here, Siegel's idea exceeds Shuster's ability to draw it for once, so Betty appears to just be floating in the air in the dark closet. There's another discrepancy where Betty again has a gun in her hand, despite still hanging in the closet, explained by a caption that says she had a second gun concealed in her dress, although where was that exactly? Does she have like a holster in the back of her dress? Before Betty starts shooting wildly from the closet, Slam, Bam Bam, got a phone call from Shorty telling him where the garage is he was captured at. So Slam leaves Betty where she is and drives off to the garage. Before Slam gets there, Shorty is recaptured and the bad guys leave with him to kill him elsewhere, leaving just one goon behind to watch the garage. Slam doesn't know what to do next until he sees the note that Shorty pinned on the man's back, without anyone having noticed him do it, and no one apparently saw him write this. So it doesn't really make sense, but this is a fast-moving story. It's very manly, and we're just going to pass that by because we know action's coming, right? Again, we're treated to an example of how Slam solves problems with violence as he threatens to drown the goon in a barrel of grease until he talks. Oh, he's tough. Up to this point, this story has been 5 or 6 panels per page, but at this point, the story kicks into its climax with Shorty taken to an unfinished skyscraper to be thrown off from the top, and panel count drops to 4 per page as Slam arrives and saves Shorty in a very big action panel. Then we see the bad guys defeated on a single 3-panel page. While this longer, more complex story seems to have given them a few, let's say, hiccups along the way, Shuster's skill for layout and understanding how to alter for each part of the story remains excellent, and we've talked before in Spy about, and also about Dr. Occult, about he has developed these skills ahead of the rest of the industry. Up to this point, I've always talked about Siegel and Shuster as if they were an inseparable pairing, but in issue 3, the Slam Bradley feature is drawn by someone different. The guest artist is an unknown cartoonist named Jim Bettersworth. Bettersworth does not seem to have examined the previous Slam Bradley stories very well, as Slam doesn't look like Slam and actually looks more like Flash Gordon. Shorty Moran looks a little like Shorty, but not really. When he's not standing right next to Slam, he doesn't even look short. Shorty is no longer the only cartoony character, so to make him stand out, his anatomy is way off. Like, he couldn't be alive and have his body twisted in this way. There's something else unusual about this version of Slam Bradley, and that's setting. The way Shuster drew the city, it looked like a big metropolis, like New York City. But this story takes place during an inland exposition. Now, this is 2 years before the World's Fair in New York City. That was my first thought about what inspired this inland exposition. So what would have the inspiration have been for this exposition that takes place in our exposition? With all these carnival rides in particular. Now, the Great Lakes Exposition of 1936 and 1937 took place in Cleveland, Siegel and Shuster's hometown. So this is our first evidence that Slam, like really all of Siegel and Shuster's characters other than Henri Duval in France, are actually placed in Cleveland, Ohio. The feature still has the signature splash page, but past that, the panel structure remains a steady 5 to 6 panels per page and doesn't change to fit the flow of the story the way Shuster was doing. The story itself isn't bad, but the art is a considerable letdown, not up to Shuster's standards, either in quality or innovation. There's no way to know why Shuster didn't draw this issue, but maybe he was sick. He also had rapidly deteriorating eyesight, and maybe he was waiting until he could afford new glasses? We're just guessing because there's really no way to know. Now, the important thing is that Shuster was back for issue 4. The splash page is not part of the story this time. For the first time, it's just summarizing the story to come. The in medias res opening begins instead at the top of page 2, already at the climax of an adventure where Slam is after an escaped murderer working as a trapeze artist, and he chases him in midair on trapeze instead of, maybe just waiting for him to come down to the ground. But that's okay. This is a dramatic opening scene, and he's manly, right? So, bam, bam, we're not going to think about this too hard. The next day, Slam's picture is on the cover of a newspaper called News Press, and sure enough, Cleveland had a newspaper called the News Press at this time. No sooner is that story over than Slam is invited out to Hollywood for a job. Now, Shuster's new innovation here, conveying the sense of the long motion of the journey. Over 2 pages, there are 4 panels of Slam and Shorty, all in motion in the same direction. First, Slam pulling Shorty so fast that Shorty is fluttering in the breeze behind him like a kite. Then with them on a train that's speeding in the same direction, and then the 2 panels in a fast-moving car in the same direction. And this motion doesn't stop until they reach the stupendous film studios and find out what they are here for. The studio president allegedly wants Slam to be a stunt double in a movie that they're filming. The movie looks so much like a Tarzan movie that we might as well just call it a Tarzan movie. And another theme that returns in the story is that Slam always has to be the manliest person in the room. So the competition here is the movie star called Larry Gary, but we can assume he's meant to be Bruce Bennett, who was playing Tarzan in the 1930s. Now, I want you to take a good long look at this page again, because I think it's really important here that the point of this scene is to totally emasculate this other man. And this is what a Slam does, right? It's, in fact, the reason why Shorty has to be so short next to him, because he's not man enough to be a big man next to Slam. And I think that these 2 nerds in Cleveland that grew up bullied and picked on felt that this was what manliness was. And I think that's kind of a sad thing. Staying on that point, I wanted to just briefly jump in issue number 5, in which we see the start of the story is that Slam is confronting an old high school bully. So there is definitely this issue that Siegel and Shuster are going through where they're dealing with past traumas, maybe, dealing with their own issues of masculinity and bullying. And we also learn about Slam here as well, that Slam wasn't always this big tough guy. Slam was maybe a bookish nerd like Siegel and Shuster, who transformed into this manly man and became their manly alter ego. And we're going to see them bump that up considerably with Superman really soon.